In NASCAR, there was one law that nobody dared to break. V8s were king. Period. End of discussion. But in 1974, a renegade mechanic looked at that law and laughed. His name was Smokey Yunick. His weapon? An engine pulled from a dump truck. And for a few terrifying weeks, he didn't just challenge the establishment. He absolutely humiliated it. He built an engine that was perfectly legal, brutally efficient, and terrifyingly powerful. An engine that made every $1 million V8 program look like a complete waste of money. But then NASCAR did something nobody expected. Something that would change motorsports history forever. This isn't just a story about an engine. This is a story about what happens when innovation becomes too dangerous to allow. When being too good becomes your biggest crime. The legend. Henry Smokey Yunick wasn't just a mechanic. He was a myth. A ghost story that NASCAR officials told each other late at night. His shop in Daytona Beach was a fortress of secrets. No cameras allowed. No casual visitors. What happened inside those walls stayed inside those walls. And when something rolled out of Smokey's garage, chaos followed. He had a philosophy that made NASCAR officials break out in cold sweats. I don't cheat. I merely capitalize on the rule book's vagueness. And brother, did he capitalize? Smokey had built fuel tanks that held twice the legal limit. He'd made cars that somehow weighed less on race day than in inspection. He'd discovered loopholes in the rulebook that NASCAR didn't even know existed. And every time officials thought they'd caught him, Smokey would pull out the rulebook and show them exactly why he was legal. He was a master of the gray area. The king of, technically legal. And NASCAR both feared and respected him for it. But what Smokey was about to build in 1973 would make all his previous tricks look like child's play. Because this time, he wasn't bending the rules. He was about to use them to destroy everything NASCAR believed in. Let's set the scene. Early 1970s. NASCAR's golden age of big block V8 dominance. Ford had their Boss 429. Chrysler had the legendary 426 Hemi. Chevrolet had their mystery motors. These weren't just engines. They were 427 cubic inches of American fury. Purpose-built race motors that shared nothing with street cars except maybe a casting number. They made 500 to 600 horsepower. They screamed to 7,000 revolutions per minute. They broke constantly. They cost absolute fortunes to build and maintain. And everyone accepted this as the only way to go racing. The factory teams had invested millions. Entire engineering departments existed just to squeeze another 10 horsepower out of these monsters. Teams had relationships with NASCAR officials that went back decades. This was the ecosystem. This was how it worked. Then October 1973 happened. The oil crisis hit America like a freight train. Gas lines stretched for miles. Prices quadrupled overnight. Suddenly, burning fuel for fun wasn't just wasteful. It was practically un-American. And NASCAR? NASCAR had a massive PR problem. Here was a sport burning through fuel at catastrophic rates, putting on shows for crowds who were increasingly worried about having enough gas to get to work on Monday morning. The optics were terrible. So NASCAR did what any good political organization does when facing bad publicity. They pretended to care. Officials started discussing fuel economy regulations, smaller displacement limits, efficiency standards. They talked about making the sport more relevant to everyday Americans dealing with gas rationing. It was all theater, of course. NASCAR had zero intention of actually changing anything substantial. But they needed to look like they cared. And buried in all this political posturing, buried deep in the rulebook where nobody ever looked, was one tiny clause that nobody had thought about in years. Turbochargers were legal. Not because NASCAR wanted turbochargers, but simply because nobody had ever made them work reliably in stock car racing. They were Indianapolis territory. Exotic, experimental, unreliable. They suffered from turbo lag, heat problems, and catastrophic failures. Conservative NASCAR teams wanted absolutely nothing to do with technology that unpredictable, which is exactly why nobody saw Smokey Yunick coming. The weapon nobody expected. While NASCAR officials were giving speeches about fuel economy and factory teams were perfecting their big block V8s, Smokey was in his shop, staring at something nobody would ever consider a race engine. The Chevrolet 292 cubic inch inline 6. This wasn't a performance motor. This was what General Motors put in delivery trucks, panel vans, industrial equipment. This was an engine designed to haul boxes and run constantly at 3,000 revolutions per minute without complaining. The specs were absolutely pathetic. 165 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. Maybe 170 on a good day with a tailwind and a prayer. When word got out about what Smokey was planning, the racing community thought he'd lost his mind. A truck engine? Against 427 cubic inch race motors? This had to be one of his publicity stunts. But Smokey saw something nobody else could see. That long 4.125-inch stroke? Perfect for turbocharging. Longer stroke means more cylinder volume per revolution, which means you can force more air and fuel in under boost pressure. That heavy cast iron block designed for delivery truck abuse? It could handle boost pressures that would blow a lighter racing block into shrapnel. Those 7 main bearings? The rigidity needed to keep everything stable under cylinder pressures that naturally aspirated engines never experienced. The 292's reputation as a durable, overbuilt workhorse wasn't a weakness. It was the foundation for something revolutionary. And Smokey had another angle. A political angle that was absolutely brilliant. In late 1973, when NASCAR was publicly discussing fuel economy rules, imagine showing up with a 6-cylinder engine that burned 30% less fuel than a V8 while making competitive power. He could argue he was doing exactly what NASCAR claimed to want. Finding performance through efficiency rather than brute displacement. It was the perfect Trojan horse. Give them what they asked for. Then use it to destroy everything they actually believed in. Smokey didn't just slap a turbocharger onto a stock 292 and call it done. What he built in his Daytona Beach shop over the next several months was a masterpiece of engineering. Every component was considered. Every potential failure point was addressed. This wasn't a prototype. This was a weapon. The foundation started with the block itself. Smokey didn't just grab any 292. He carefully inspected castings, looking for the densest iron with the fewest imperfections. Some blocks were rejected immediately. Others were sonic tested to verify wall thickness. Only the strongest survived. Stock pistons? Forget it. Cast aluminum designed for 165 horsepower wasn't going to handle forced induction. Smokey installed forged pistons. The compression ratio dropped from 8.0 to 1 to around 7.5 to 1. Low enough to prevent detonation under boost, but high enough to maintain efficiency when off boost. Custom head gaskets, thicker than stock, provided better sealing against increased cylinder pressures. But where Smokey's genius really showed was the turbocharger system. This was completely custom. Every piece was designed through hundreds of hours of testing and iteration. The exhaust manifold was entirely Smokey's creation. It had to collect exhaust from 6 cylinders, maintain proper flow velocity to spool the turbo efficiently, and package everything within NASCAR's template rules. Getting exhaust flow right on an inline 6 is incredibly tricky. The firing order creates exhaust pulses that can either help or hinder turbo response depending on manifold design. Smokey figured this out through trial and error, testing different configurations until he found the optimal solution. The wastegate, the valve that bleeds off excess exhaust pressure to control boost, was purely mechanical. A spring-loaded valve that opened when boost pressure reached the desired level. Simple, reliable, no electronics to fail. Now here's where most teams in the 1970s failed with turbochargers: heat management. Turbochargers compress air. And compressing air generates massive heat. Hot air is less dense than cool air, which means less oxygen per cubic inch, which means less power. Worse, hot air dramatically increases the risk of detonation. Smokey built a custom air-to-air intercooler from aircraft aluminum. He likely fabricated the core himself, testing different designs to find the optimal balance between cooling efficiency and airflow restriction. The intercooler sat in the front of the car, positioned to catch maximum airflow. Ducting routed compressed air from the turbo through the intercooler, cooling it by 100 degrees or more, then back to the carburetor. And speaking of the carburetor, this is where most 1970s turbo attempts completely fell apart. Carburetors are designed to work under vacuum. The engine sucks air through the carburetor venturis, creating low pressure that draws fuel from the float bowls. Simple, reliable, proven technology. But add a turbocharger and suddenly you're trying to push pressurized air through a carburetor designed to work under vacuum. Fuel metering goes completely haywire. Seals leak. The whole system falls apart. Smokey's solution was what's called a blow-through setup, and it was brilliant. He mounted the carburetor inside a pressurized box. The entire carburetor sat in an enclosure that was pressurized to match boost pressure. This way, the pressure differential across the carburetor remained constant whether the engine was under boost or not. The carburetor still experienced vacuum conditions relative to the box pressure, so fuel metering stayed accurate. It worked perfectly under boost and off boost. It was simple, elegant, and completely non-obvious unless you really understood how carburetors and turbochargers worked. Ignition timing was another critical piece. Boosted engines need different timing curves than naturally aspirated motors. Too much timing under boost and you get detonation. Too little and you lose power. Smokey modified the distributor's advance curve extensively through testing. Cooling was another obsession. Smokey installed an oversized radiator, a high-flow water pump, and added a dedicated oil cooler for the turbo. The turbo's bearings relied on engine oil for lubrication, and that oil had to stay cool enough to maintain proper viscosity. Header wrap managed exhaust heat, keeping temperatures contained rather than radiating into the engine bay. Every potential failure point was addressed before it became an actual failure. And then came the moment of truth. When Smokey finally strapped his turbocharged 292 to the dynamometer, the numbers that came up on the display shouldn't have been possible. 450 horsepower. Some runs showed 475. Peak runs allegedly touched 500 horsepower. From 292 cubic inches. Let that sink in for a second. NASCAR's big block V8's 427 cubic inches of purpose-built racing motor were making 500 to 550 horsepower. That's roughly 1.17 to 1.29 horsepower per cubic inch. Smokey's truck engine was making 1.54 to 1.71 horsepower per cubic inch. The displacement disadvantage had completely disappeared. In raw power output, the turbocharged six-cylinder matched or exceeded naturally aspirated V8s that were 46% larger. But the power curve told an even better story. V8s made peak power at high RPM, typically 6,000 to 7,000 revolutions per minute. Below 4,000 revolutions per minute, they were gutless by comparison. The power delivery was peaky, requiring drivers to keep engines screaming in the power band. Smokey's turbocharged 292 made massive torque across the entire RPM range. That long stroke combined with forced induction created a flat torque curve from 3,000 revolutions per minute all the way to 6,000 revolutions per minute. The engine pulled hard everywhere. It made it easier to drive, more forgiving out of corners, and less dependent on perfect gear selection. And there was more. An inline six with a turbocharger weighed significantly less than a big block V8, probably 100 to 150 pounds lighter overall. In racing, weight is everything. Less weight improves acceleration, braking, and handling. It reduces tire wear. It makes the entire car more responsive. Smokey could move that weight savings around the car, optimizing balance in ways V8 competitors couldn't. The center of gravity was lower too. An inline configuration sits lower in the engine bay than a V8, which improves cornering stability. And then there was fuel economy. Remember, this was still nominally important in 1973 to 1974 when NASCAR was pretending to care about the fuel crisis. Smokey's turbocharged six-cylinder used 20 to 30% less fuel than a comparable V8 making the same power. But fewer cylinders mean fewer intake strokes, less pumping losses. The engine was smaller, so it required less fuel per revolution. The turbo recovered energy from exhaust that would otherwise be wasted. Thermodynamic efficiency was simply better. So now Smokey had an engine that made competitive power, weighed less, had better weight distribution, delivered superior low-end torque, and burned significantly less fuel. It was better in almost every measurable way. The only question was, would it work on the track? The first time Smokey's car rolled onto Daytona International Speedway for testing, something was immediately wrong. The sound. It wasn't the deep, rumbling thunder of V8 exhaust that echoed through the grandstands. It was something different. A smooth inline-six hum mixed with an unmistakable turbo whistle. It sounded foreign. It sounded like something from Indianapolis, not Daytona. Competitors gathered in the pits, watching with amusement. Some laughed openly. A truck engine at a NASCAR track? This had to be another one of Smokey's publicity stunts. Good for a headline, but it would never be competitive. Then Smokey posted his qualifying time. The laughter stopped. Not slow. Not embarrassing. Legitimately competitive with 427 cubic inch V8s. The amusement turned to curiosity. How was a six-cylinder keeping pace with purpose-built race motors? The second test session was faster. Smokey had made adjustments overnight, refined the setup. The lap times improved noticeably. Now competitors weren't amused. They were paying attention. The third test session was faster still. And now people were getting angry. Because this wasn't supposed to be possible. Everyone knew that displacement was king. Everyone knew that inline sixes were economy engines, not race motors. Everyone knew that turbochargers were unreliable and complicated. Except Smokey's engine kept proving all of that wrong. Lap after lap. Session after session. The turbocharged 292 ran reliably, made power, and posted competitive times. NASCAR officials descended on the car like vultures. They measured the engine with precision instruments. They checked displacement. Yes, it was really 292 cubic inches. Not 293. Not 295. Exactly 292. They verified the turbocharger. Yes, it was really a turbo, not some hidden displacement trick or illegal modification. They pulled out the rulebook and started reading. Turbochargers? Legal. No rule against them. Chevrolet 292? Production-based engine. Legal. Everything checked out. Nothing violated any written rule. But it violated something far more important than written rules. It violated the culture, the identity, the fundamental mythology of NASCAR. NASCAR's entire identity was built on American V8 muscle. Cubic inches. Horsepower through displacement. That's what stock car racing was. That's what it had always been. Smokey's turbocharged six-cylinder was a direct challenge to that foundational belief. And that made it dangerous. Not dangerous because it was unsafe. Not dangerous because it cheated. Dangerous because it worked. The panic spreads. Behind closed doors, panic was spreading through the NASCAR garage like wildfire. Factory engineers from Ford and Chrysler watched stone-faced as a truck engine from Chevrolet, a brand that had officially withdrawn from factory racing support, made their sacred V8s look primitive. Do you understand what was at stake here? Ford had invested millions developing the Boss 429. An entire engineering staff. Years of development. Relationships with NASCAR officials. Sponsorship deals. Race teams. Chrysler had the legendary 426 Hemi. A motor so famous it had become an icon of American performance. Millions of dollars in development costs. And Smokey Yunick just proved their entire development philosophy was obsolete. Worse, he did it with a truck engine and a turbocharger. The implications were absolutely terrifying for factory teams. If Smokey's approach worked, it meant Ford didn't need the Boss 429. Chrysler didn't need the 426 Hemi. Chevrolet didn't need special racing blocks. You could take production-based engines, add turbochargers, and achieve the same results for a fraction of the cost. That threatened millions of dollars in factory racing budgets. It threatened jobs. It threatened the entire structure of NASCAR competition. The phone calls started immediately. Ford representatives contacted NASCAR officials. Chrysler representatives contacted NASCAR officials. The message was clear and direct. This turbocharger situation needs to be addressed. The arguments they made publicly were creative. Turbochargers provide an unfair advantage. This isn't real stock car racing. It's too complicated for teams to maintain. It's unsafe. The real argument was much simpler, but they couldn't say it out loud. This threatens our investment in traditional development, and if you don't kill it, we'll reconsider our involvement in NASCAR. Bill France Sr., NASCAR's founder and the ultimate political operator, found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, Smokey's engine was technically legal. Banning it would be admitting they were changing rules specifically to stop one competitor. Bad optics. On the other hand, factory teams were threatening to reduce or eliminate support if NASCAR didn't act. And NASCAR needed factory support far more than it needed Smokey Yunick. So Bill France did what sanctioning bodies always do when innovation becomes politically inconvenient. He invented a solution that looked fair on paper but was specifically designed to kill the threat. The bureaucratic murder. The announcement came down like a guillotine. NASCAR invoked a new equivalency formula for forced induction engines. The reasoning sounded logical, almost scientific. Forced induction artificially increases an engine's effective displacement by forcing more air into the cylinders. Therefore, turbocharged engines need a displacement multiplier to create fair competition. The multiplier they chose? 1.7. Let's do the math. Smokey's 292 cubic inch engine, multiplied by 1.7, equals 496 cubic inches. NASCAR's maximum displacement limit? 427 cubic inches. Overnight, Smokey's perfectly legal engine became illegal. Not because he violated any rules, Not because he cheated. Not because he endangered anyone. But because he succeeded too well. And here's the truly cynical part that should make your blood boil. The rule was applied retroactively. Smokey had built his engine under rules where turbochargers were legal. He'd invested months of work. His own money. Solved countless engineering problems. Tested it. Proved it worked. Violated zero regulations. And then NASCAR changed the rules to make his engine illegal after the fact. Imagine spending months developing technology, pouring your heart and soul into innovation, proving your concept works better than anything else out there, and then having the sanctioning body change the rules specifically to stop you. Not because you broke the rules. Not because you cheated. Not because you endangered anyone. Because you were too good. Because you threatened the wrong people. Because politics mattered more than innovation. Smokey was furious. Absolutely livid. He argued that turbochargers had always been legal. That he'd followed all existing rules. That changing regulations retroactively was fundamentally unfair and un-American. NASCAR's response was essentially, too bad. Later, in his autobiography, Smokey would write with barely contained rage. They didn't want it. It was that simple. It would have made the racing V8s obsolete, and that would have upset the factories. The political reality was brutally simple. NASCAR needed factory teams more than it needed Smokey Yunick. Factory teams wanted the turbo threat eliminated. Therefore, the turbo threat would be eliminated. Innovation didn't matter. Engineering brilliance didn't matter. Efficiency didn't matter. Being right didn't matter. Politics mattered. And politics killed Smokey's turbocharged 292 before it ever got a real chance to compete. The engine that could have changed everything was executed in a boardroom, not beaten on a racetrack. Smokey kept that engine. He stored it in his Daytona Beach shop like a trophy from a war he wasn't allowed to fight. Occasionally, he'd roll it out for demonstrations. Fire it up on a dyno for journalists or enthusiasts who wanted to see the legend in action. The turbo would spool, that distinctive whistle would fill the shop, and for a moment, you could imagine what could have been. But the rest of the racing world was paying very close attention to what happened. By the late 1970s, turbochargers began conquering every form of motorsports. Except NASCAR. IndyCar went all in on turbos. The Cosworth DFX turbocharged V8 dominated IndyCar racing from 1978 through the entire 1980s. These engines made 700 to 800 horsepower in race trim. Over 1,000 horsepower in qualifying. Every principle Smokey had demonstrated with his 292 became accepted truth at Indianapolis. Formula One's turbo era began in 1977 when Renault introduced a turbocharged 1.5-liter V6. By the mid-1980s, every competitive F1 team ran turbos. Qualifying engines produced over 1,400 horsepower from 1.5 liters. That's over 900 horsepower per liter. Absolutely insane numbers that proved turbocharging was the future of racing performance. IMSA Sports Car Racing saw Porsche's turbocharged 911s and 962s dominate. Turbos won Le Mans. They won everywhere. Everywhere except NASCAR, which stubbornly maintained naturally aspirated V8 supremacy through rules rather than competitive superiority. And then something beautiful happened on American streets. The Buick Grand National arrived. Buick's turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 was basically a street-legal version of what Smokey had tried to do. And it absolutely humiliated V8 muscle cars throughout the 1980s. The GNX version made 276 horsepower officially, probably 300 plus in reality, from 231 cubic inches. Smokey's vision vindicated on public roads, destroying Corvettes and Mustangs at every stoplight. Fast forward to today. BMW's turbocharged inline 6 makes 382 horsepower in the M340i. The Toyota Supra's 3.0-liter turbocharged inline 6 makes 382 horsepower. Ford's 3.5-liter EcoBoost V6 makes 450 horsepower in the F-150 Raptor. Turbocharged 6-cylinders making 300 to 400 plus horsepower are completely normal now. They power everything from family SUVs to sports cars to pickup trucks. Everything Smokey proved in 1974, the world eventually accepted as truth. Except NASCAR. NASCAR clung to naturally aspirated Vs for 50 years. Not because they were better. They demonstrably weren't. But because changing would mean admitting they'd been wrong. It would mean admitting they'd killed innovation for political reasons. It would mean admitting Smokey Yunick was right and they were wrong. NASCAR chose politics over progress. And they paid for it. While the rest of the racing world embraced turbocharging and advanced to new levels of performance, NASCAR stagnated. The sport became increasingly irrelevant to automotive technology. The connection between race cars and street cars, the stock in stock car racing, disappeared entirely. Modern NASCAR runs purpose-built tube-frame cars with V8s that share absolutely nothing with showroom vehicles. They're spectacular race cars, but they're completely divorced from automotive reality. Only recently, reluctantly, is NASCAR finally discussing hybrid powertrains and smaller displacement forced induction engines. They're finally learning the lesson Smokey tried to teach them half a century ago. We're left with the greatest what-if in NASCAR history. What if Smokey Yunick's turbocharged 292 had been allowed to race? What if NASCAR had embraced innovation instead of killing it? Would Smokey have won the Daytona 500 with a truck engine? Would other teams have followed his lead, creating a turbocharged revolution in stock car racing? Would NASCAR have remained relevant to automotive technology instead of becoming a technological museum piece? Would the sport be bigger, more innovative, more connected to the cars people actually drive today? We'll never know. Because that engine never won a race. It never got the chance. But here's what we do know. In the minds of engineers, drivers, and fans who understand what actually happened, Smokey won the argument. Every modern turbocharged race car proves he was right. Every forced induction street car proves he was right. Every high-performance six-cylinder proves he was right. NASCAR just didn't want to hear it. That engine still exists somewhere, probably in pieces scattered among collectors and museums. But its legacy is undeniable. Smokey Yunick looked at NASCAR's most sacred belief, that V8s were untouchable, and he destroyed it with a dump truck engine and a turbocharger. They killed his engine before it could change everything. But they couldn't kill the truth. When you choose tradition over progress, when you choose politics over performance, when you choose fear over innovation, you don't stay the same. You fall behind. And 50 years later, NASCAR is still trying to catch up to where Smokey Yunick was in 1974. The engine was silenced. But history remembers who was right. This is Torque Sega, where legends are built and the truth never dies.